You're listening to Now I've Heard Everything. Conversations with the icons of our time.
The commonly held view of Ronald Reagan, which I have held for years, was that he was an ordinary man who did extraordinary things. And I have changed my mind about that. I think he was an extraordinary man.
Former Reagan speechwriter Peggy Noonan today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. Broadly speaking, there are two schools of thought about the presidency of Ronald Reagan. On the one hand, some see Reagan as the personification of everything that was wrong with the 1980s, especially as it was characterized by that movie line, "Greed is good." But then there are those who revere our 40th president, not just as a great president, but as a rare and exceptional leader of great principle and virtue. Into that latter category falls Peggy Noonan, Ronald Reagan's former top speechwriter who crafted some of his most memorable orations. In 2001, a dozen years after he left office, Ronald Reagan was the subject of an admiring book by Peggy Noonan called When Character Was King. And that's when she and I had one of our many conversations over the years. In just a moment, that conversation.
Over a 30-year span, national radio personality Bill Thompson did over 10,000 interviews with people who had a hand in shaping our culture and our society. Here is one of those interviews. Enjoy.
So here now, from 2001, Peggy Noonan.
A number of things, I think, inspired me to get going on this. I started out just a few months ago, actually, doing a book about anecdotes about President Reagan, because there were things about him, stories about him, and about his nature that I wanted to capture and give to people, to give to three types of people. One is young people who are 20 years old now and who were children who were born when he walked into the White House and who don't know very much about him. Some of them are on the wonderful ship, the good ship, the USS Ronald Reagan. A bunch of kids who were 18, 19, 20, 21 years old who are so happy to be serving on the USS Reagan and who know about him essentially that he was a movie star and he became a president. And that's a pretty fascinating thing. But I told them, well, I'm going to tell you some more about him. So there was the desire to talk to the young, the desire to talk to those who love Reagan, because I want to talk to them about why I love him. I want to explain it. And to those who do not like Reagan, I want them to look at him in a new way, not at what they think of as his smooth style and sunny confidence and good-looking bonhomie, but as a man of great and deep character.
I gather that more than once, someone that you were talking to about Ronald Reagan suddenly got a lump in their throat.
Oh, it happens.
Suddenly a little tear in their eye, and suddenly they had to just turn away for a moment and compose themselves.
It happens constantly with those aged 40 to 80 who worked for Ronald Reagan 20 years ago. Or 30 years ago. Anyone who knew Reagan and who talks about him in the year of 2001, it is so amazing to me that when they talk about him, sooner or later along the way, they get a lump in their throat, their eyes fill up with tears, and they look away. To one of these people, because they're always telling you a story that to them is moving about him, or they're trying to capture who he was as a human being. One of the guys I spoke to, a fabulous guy named David Fisher. Dave Fisher worked for Ronald Reagan in the White House, and before the White House, he was kind of his body man. He took care of what Reagan needed, and he was always at Reagan's side when Reagan was out giving a speech or an appearance. Fisher saw Reagan behind the scenes. Fisher was a young man when he worked for Reagan in his 20s and in his 30s, and he left Reagan when he was in his 40s. I'm talking to Fisher now. Just a few months ago, it was the summer of 2001, and he's telling me about how he left the White House, how Dave Fisher left the White House, and how he said goodbye to President Reagan. And as he was just talking about their simple goodbye to each other after a dozen years of working together, Dave Fisher's eyes filled up and he had to stop speaking. And there was a moment of complete silence between us as I listened to the tape recorder roll silently. And then I said, "You loved him, didn't you?" And he said, "Yes." And he sort of suggested, and I didn't know how much. And he was very moving. He said something that I found to be true of myself, and I found it to be true of others. We all thought the impact of working with Ronald Reagan would recede with time, that it would simply lessen with time. One goes on to other things. One lives other lives. But for all of us, Reagan has not become a smaller figure with time, but a bigger figure with time, as if, you know, if you are up close to a mountain, it's just a hunk of rocks and dirt, right? Mm-hmm. But if you travel 2, 3, 4 miles away from the mountain and look back, you can see how it changed the landscape and how it changes the landscape. It's as if we left Reagan in the 80s, and now it's the year 2001. We've traveled far enough, we turn around and we look at him, and we're saying to each other, he was a giant. So there's a new rediscovery of our love for him and our deep respect for what he did in the world.
Yep. Richard Nixon accomplished great things as a president. Lyndon Johnson accomplished great things as a president. John F. Kennedy accomplished great things. But why do we not have people speaking in the same loving and admiring and look what a great man he was tone about those presidents?
Ronald Reagan was America's last wartime president. He won World War III. The year, or really a matter of months after he left the presidency in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Why did it fall? Because Ronald Reagan spent 8 years pushing it. He was a triumphantly successful president in foreign affairs. Equally as important, in America, he changed America's attitude about what it owed the government and what the government could do to the American people, what was owed to the government, what the government owed in return. He lowered taxes on all Americans. He once again encouraged people to be entrepreneurial, to take risks. He encouraged people to invest. What happened? Not only the biggest peacetime economic expansion up to that point in American history, but also the beginning of the investment in such things as obscure technology companies in Silicon Valley in California. I mean, Ronald Reagan literally changed the geography of the world by ending the Soviet Union, and literally changed all the facts of the world by reigniting American prosperity and sending it throughout the world. This is a president whose accomplishments are huge and are simply dwarf those, in my view, of Kennedy, of Johnson, of Nixon. This was something special, and it was led by a guy who I think was really marked with a certain destiny to go on into life and to do great things. It is, as you know, the commonly held view of Ronald Reagan, which I have held for years, up until only the past few years, was that he was an ordinary man who did extraordinary things. And I have changed my mind about that. You know, looking at his life, talking to those in his family, talking to his friends, I think he was an extraordinary man with some kind of huge destiny playing out within him. So a most extraordinary man who did extraordinary things.
For a man whose eyesight wasn't the best, he did seem to have an extraordinary focus about his life, didn't he?
He did indeed. I am very interested in the issue of Ronald Reagan and his eyesight. You know, there are two things that might be said about it. One is that, you know, Ronald Reagan, when he spoke in public, his eyes were not good, but he could read up close. He could read a text up close without glasses, but to read a teleprompter and to see an audience, the real faces on an audience, he needed glasses. So he went through his public life with contact lenses, with one contact lens in one eye, so that eye could see the audience and could see the teleprompter, and no contact lens in the other eye, so that if the teleprompter stopped, he'd be able to read the text he held in his hand. It seems to me that that is almost metaphoric for a certain ability to see the long view, to be long-sighted. Do you know what I mean? And then, in a common way, be doing your everyday work.
What George Bush the Elder would have referred to as the vision thing.
You got it. He had the vision thing in spades.
But it is so common for people now, and it's not any one person. Everyone seems to take the poll and figure out what should I be doing? Let's ask people. Let's find out what I should be doing. Ronald Reagan didn't take polls to figure out what he needed to do.
He did not, and I think that Ronald Reagan loved polls, and I'll tell you why. I'm quite serious. Polls were just fine with him. He liked it when Richard Worthland, his pollster, came in and told him what the people are saying. Ronald Reagan understood what polling is for. Ronald Reagan agreed with Abe Lincoln, who said, public opinion is everything, meaning a president who leads the people can't get too far ahead of the people. He must bring them along with him, and that takes a certain amount of thinking about strategy and how to approach people and how to talk to them. So, if Lincoln had had polling in his day, he would have used polling to figure out whether this way, talking about slavery, was the right way to be going, or if this tack was the right way to be going, or if this congressional tack might be the right way. He would use polls to figure that out. That's what Reagan did. Reagan used polls to figure out what the American people were thinking. He did not use polls to figure out what he was going to think. He knew what he was going to, he knew what he thought. He knew what he wanted to do. He knew how he wanted to do it, but he would change sometimes how he wanted to do it if he could see that it just wouldn't work with the American people, and he could tell that through polling data. Now, naturally, like any other political figure, he also had an ego. Everybody in politics has an ego. Certainly everybody in Hollywood, where he got his start, has an ego. And I know that there were times when he was feeling a little blue, when his pollster would come in and say, let me tell you what your personal numbers are, and they'd be off the charts. I know that cheered Ronald Reagan up.
People in Hollywood understand Q ratings.
Do you know what, though, something about Reagan and polls? You're making me think of something that is not in the book. You know, when Abe Lincoln died, somebody eventually looked in the wallet that he was carrying on his person the night he was shot, and they found a Confederate bill, I think a Confederate $2 bill, which someone had sent him and had in his wallet, and also a very complimentary About Abe Lincoln newspaper clipping, which he had bothered to put in his wallet. And clearly he was going to be taking out and reading now and then when he was having a blue day. So I have nothing, it's fine that presidents use polling to know where the people are. But it is a disgrace to the very idea of leadership to use polls to decide what to do. And what you believe in. That's what was done throughout the 90s, and that's part of how we got into the fix we're in.
Well, Ronald Reagan had a true north, that he knew what was, or at least he had a very clear idea of what it was that needed to be done, didn't he?
Sure. I mean, he had clear views that he felt that he came to at some cost and with some effort. For instance.
And he knew we wouldn't always agree with that.
Absolutely. And he held to those views if he thought he was right. He would always change his mind if he thought he was wrong. But you really had to convince him that he was wrong. You could not convince him that he was unpopular on a specific issue, therefore he must change it. For instance, abortion. Ronald Reagan spoke more against abortion. He became the leading anti-abortion voice from the time of Roe versus Wade straight through the time when he could no longer talk in the mid to late 1990s, when he could no longer talk in a persuasive manner. Ronald Reagan knew that in the early days, by about 1980 or so, when he was running for the presidency, the numbers at that time on abortion were something like, considered to be like 80-20 or 75-25, with 80 or 75% of the American people being for abortion rights, quote unquote, and the minority being very pro-life and very much against abortion. You could not sit with Ronald Reagan and say, as Jim Baker did sometimes, Mr. President, it's an 80-20, gotta get off it. Ronald Reagan would not get off it because it was an 80-20. His idea was, if it is correct that a child in the womb be protected, then you must move in that direction and you must talk about it and try to win people over. Now, whatever you think about his position, pro-life or pro-choice, on abortion, whatever you think of his position, you gotta give him credit for standing at great cost where he stood.
That is character.
Yeah. Part of character is just knowing that you're gonna pay a price to take a controversial stand. And what price you will pay to stand where you think you have to be is a real way of judging one's character.
Does having character attract others with character to you? I mean, is it a cumulative effect?
Well, that's an interesting question. Nobody's ever asked me that. There were a number of people around Ronald Reagan, who were people of very high and great character. But I would think it is also fair to say that as he moved on in the world and politics, politicians also It's like politician is the magnet, and the little metal filings of people who have all sorts of motives can start to follow them.
That's very diplomatically put.
You know, thank you. So sure, there were some scoundrels there. You know, there's all types of people around a powerful man. It was Nancy Reagan's job, in part, to make sure that the people around the president were people who she felt had good motives and were there to help him and could effectively help him. It was very important to her. He was very much a lover of America. After all, he thought, in part, you know, we all use phrases like the American dream, you can go from nowhere and become anything. But Ronald Reagan didn't think phrases like the American dream were abstract or corny. He thought he had lived the American dream. He was a nobody who came from nothing town, from the flat, dry middle of America, with a dad who was an alcoholic who couldn't hold a job, and a mother who was an evangelical Christian who said, hold on. She filled him with a sense of optimism that was a very Christian kind of trust Christ optimism. And he went on, and he went from a family where they didn't have enough food to eat and where they didn't always have electricity. He went from that within a quarter century to being a Hollywood star in a mansion with a pool. So the idea of the American dream was not abstract to him. He didn't think America was perfect. He didn't think everybody got an even shot. He felt there was injustice in the world. He worried about, he was brought up in his father's liberal democratic instincts towards, you're never bigoted or prejudiced against anybody who's different from you, and we have to help black people, and we have to make sure Jews don't feel excluded. I mean, his father really taught him that. That was the type of thing that was unusual to be teaching a kid, say, in 1920 in the middle of America. But Reagan, who did not think that the American dream was perfect, still thought it was American and a dream, and he held it close to his heart, and he loved his country. He loved it.
Peggy Noonan is 74 now. She writes a column for the Wall Street Journal. Now, you can get your copy of When Character Was King by Peggy Noonan by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also hear my 1989 interview with the president's daughter, Maureen Reagan.
He came on the scene at a time when the American people were losing confidence in themselves. And his confidence in them allowed this nation to begin to get its own wheel moving. And that was the most important thing that he could bring. And
my 2013 interview with the Secret Service agent who saved Ronald Reagan's life that day in 1981, Jerry Parr.
I said, I'm taking you to the hospital, and I said it was a certain amount of authority, and he didn't argue. Even if he had argued, I would have said, well, I'm taking you anyway, and then you can fire me. I didn't tell him I thought he was hurt bad.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, do you believe in alien abductions, and UFOs, and extraterrestrials? We'll revisit my 1992 conversation with a professor who's made a study of these things and says, yes, people do get abducted. David Jacobs.
With the abduction phenomenon, what we get is people reporting basically the exploitation of one species over another for purposes that we don't fully understand, for an agenda that we don't fully understand.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.